Thank you guys for being here, and we're going to talk about advanced animation. So this is predicated on the assumption that you have some understanding of animation. You've either tried it, you've opened it, you've used it, or you've seen somebody else use it. And you're looking to maybe do something a little less conventional, maybe something a little more interesting, something else. That's kind of what this is based on. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to run through my presentation. It'll take the first maybe 25-30 minutes of giving you kind of ideas and covering principles, and then we're going to get hands-on, and I'm going to walk through as much of it as I can in real time, and then what we'll do is, if you can hold questions until we're done with the session, I'll try to address as many of those as possible in the hallways or when we're mingling outside or tonight. So yeah, let's get going, okay? So advanced animation, let's do one slide at a time. Okay, so I'm Will Gibbons, and if we haven't met before, I look forward to meeting you a little bit later. I do training for Luxion on site, and so I spend most of my time working with design or engineering groups, bringing the level of KeyShot skills up a notch, and generally speaking, once a group has had myself in to do some training, maybe every 6 months or a little bit later, every year if we do a big release, I'll go back with the same group and do brush up training or focus training on a specific topic, things like that. So I am based out of Tustin, California as of 3 weeks ago, or up near LA. And if you need to get a hold of me, jot down will@luxion.com. I do not have business cards to throw at you right now. So pretty easy to remember, but I will respond to emails you send me with questions or anything like that. So cool. So I come from a product design background with experiences probably not unlike many of you, and I'm very familiar with the process of using design to solve complex or multifaceted problems, and then turn those into solutions that we and then commercialize, of course. So through that process, I got my education in Michigan doing that, and then I moved to Southern California to work in the cycling industry, which was a lot of fun. And then I switched over to doing some consulting when I lived in Pennsylvania in a very remote area for a few years. And that's when I really started doing a lot more KeyShot. I was doing some consulting for various groups, but in that process I learned that I really enjoyed just making images, kind of creating an image that evoked some sort of emotion or told a story, instead of just making a pretty product or something. So I've been doing the actual training for Luxion over the past 2 years, doing on-site training, and now I love really exploring all the nooks and crannies of this industry as a whole. So just various collection of some of the shots I've done recently. As far as today's workshop, we're really going to be getting into a mixed bag of best practices. These are not organized or chronological by any means, but they are kind of things that I think of that I think took me a while to come to realize through my own journey, and hopefully can save you some time. And then we will look at 3 different types of animation. This is camera animations, part animations, and material animations. And I'm not going to break them down step by step because we have lots of documentation online already where you can get these. YouTube.com/KeyShot3D is our channel, and you can find previous webinars on animations, animating cameras, animating parts, things like that. What I'm trying to do here today is show you something a little bit different and kind of challenge the way you approach some of these. Yeah, so we have some bonus content at the end, a couple things. I want to just at least explain what a studio switch event is. You might have heard that studios are a new feature that was implemented in KeyShot 7, and there is a way to animate the switching between those. But outside of that, animation itself has not changed for KeyShot 7 necessarily. And then I also want to tell you that, or show you how you can import a deformation animation to use to give more life to some of your animations as well. So without further ado, we're going to jump in. First best practices point here is to use references. You guys have probably run into this in the other workshops, or if you haven't, you probably will. You'll get sick of hearing it, but the good thing is you'll probably remember it. And the reason we want to use references is we're great at remembering things, and we can remember a lot of things, but that's because our brain has a way of efficiently summarizing and like generalizing and then chunking that information. It helps us survive, because if we had to remember how many steps there are in driving a car. Well, we'd never get to work and we'd probably die in the process because we wouldn't be paying attention to other things. So while it's good that we can generalize and remember a bunch of stuff, it can be hard to remember the details and actually remember what color a wall looks like with a direct daylight on it, and then the bump texture and kind of how it fades into the orange light that's coming from the kitchen or whatever. So we use references for those, both still references like images and videos. So I recommend Pinterest for all of its convenience, because you can collect images, organize them, share them with others, clients, yourselves, or keep them private. It's just a very convenient tool. And really the challenge here is to pick apart and really question why an image or an animation is actually successful. Like actually challenge yourself to say like, okay, where's the light coming from? Why does it look like that color? And you know, if it's an animation, look at things like transitions and pacing and stuff like that. So beyond references, another thing that I recommend is storyboarding. And this is kind of maybe an older practice, but I love it because it's a very quick way to get ideas down on paper, of course. And you can spend a lot of time. When you go digital, we can get pulled and sucked into these little details, and we can lose time very quickly. And of course, we always are being asked to do more in less time. So we can storyboard out our idea, and each of these little, what you do is just grab a blank piece of paper, divide it into a few sections. So you might have 9 or 12 boxes on a sheet of paper. And within these cells or these boxes, just sketch in a very rough or generalized idea of what your key image is. And each one of these should kind of be like a bullet point within a story or a concept or some sort of message, you know. So if it's we have a product and we introduce the audience to the product, and then the camera gets close to the product and we see the details of the product and we see how the product articulates or falls apart or you know, moves around, or and then we, you know, have the product do a little, you know, acrobatic thing and then reassemble itself. That is kind of a story and a message. We're saying, here's the product, here's what it looks like, here's how it operates, and here's how sexy it is, whatever. And this can be conveyed on a sheet of paper with a storyboard. And you can do this quickly. Make sure that those little thumbnails, that's what we call those small images in our storyboard, make sure that those read well at a small scale. So you can block things in, and hopefully you can show these to your coworker or your neighbor and say, does this make sense? Can you read this? They say, switch this one with this one. And it's just, again, we're talking about saving time and making sure you nail down a good direction before you get buried in the challenge of making the actual animation. Cool. So after that, something I really like to do or talk about is just rendering frames. This sounds silly, but with KeyShot, when you do an animation, what we're going to get is a sequence of images, and each image has a slight change, and when we play them all back nice and fast, it leads to an animation. Great. Well, KeyShot, of course, can output a video file, which is great, but there are benefits to actually not using the video file that KeyShot creates if you need to do a little bit more editing to that set of images. So what I mean by that is, I'll show you in the render output, you can turn off you know, output video, and then you can just rely on the folder of images KeyShot will make, and those are the frames of your animation. And the reason you might want to do that is, first and foremost, if you are somebody who needs to use transparency, so let's say you want to comp this, you want to put a background or a video plate or something in behind, you can't really output video with a transparent background, but what we can do is we can output a sequence of PNG images or TIFF images with alpha, and then you can use those to have your transparent layer. The other thing that I really like to render frames for is the ability to you know, kind of control you can output an image with a greater bit depth, which allows for better pushing and pulling of contrast and tone mapping if you are going to go so far to do editing in, say, After Effects or Premiere Pro or any type of application like that. The other thing is you can actually resequence those. So you've got your frame, a folder of, say, 500 frames. If you have 3 scenes or 3 shots, and every 150 frames is another scene or another shot, if you realize that you thought they looked good in this order, but then you go from like a black background on one to a white background on the other, it's kind of jarring, you might find that resequencing those will make that a more pleasant viewing experience. And you can do that if you've got these frames. You can kind of play with them, and just all you have to do is rename them or reorder them in your animation, or editing package. So anyway, this all goes to say that there's a lot of benefits to breaking these down into either smaller chunks or rendering out frames. And the way this works is you go from KeyShot to your rendered frames, and then into some sort of editing program. Pretty much anything out there will compile an image sequence, and then you can export and choose the codec and the compression and all that stuff, so it will play back on whatever platform you're eventually going to publish it to. Oh, lots of jargon in there, sorry about that. Let's talk next about speed. So bonus points, show of hands, who can name what both those films are from? I know at least one person here can. I hope it's not just me. Okay, we got that one on the left, and then you have to know the other one. Transformers, okay, so 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick. We got Transformers, Michael Bay. They couldn't be further apart from each other as far as pacing goes. One has been known to put some people to sleep despite being a masterful film. It's very slow paced, and the other one addresses a generation that has no patience for anything. So they are so different from each other, and in my mind, you can go either way, but so many of the animations I see people publish are more on the 2001: A Space Odyssey side. Like I can go get a coffee before it's done with its turntable, and that's a problem, right? We want to have some sort of level of engagement, but not have them too fast. And the idea is to find the Goldilocks porridge right in the middle. And so think about that, you know. All right, let's talk about organization. So if all you do is, if you're the only person working on creating animations, you can, you know, your files can be as messy as you'd like. But a lot of us like to, or have to share our files and play together and work with other collaborators. And what we want to do is make sure that we make our files easy to work with. Even if it's just you going back a year later into an old file, you want things labeled and organized, okay? And along the left-hand side here, we can see in this KeyShot timeline, in this example, everything is pretty much clearly labeled, and then in some cases put into folders, which is nice. And then I also try to kind of in the top left, I try to have an organization where I go from top left to bottom right, where things kind of happen in a chronological descending order. If that doesn't make any sense, that's probably because you haven't worked with animation yet. That's okay, but we'll show some of this in the hands-on here. But yes, you can indeed name individual transforms, as we call them, or animations. You can reorder them, drag to drop. You can put them in folders. You can even mirror those. We'll talk about that. All right, so noise and performance. So when you are working on an animation, sometimes what happens is your computer is struggling to render the materials that you've applied to your model while it's trying to play back the animation that you've told it to do. And that can be tough. So what I recommend doing is working in performance mode or the geometry view until you've nailed down the actual motion. You should be able to create, something I like to do is I challenge myself to create an animation that I'm stoked on even before I apply lighting or materials. Like if you can get just the way the thing moves and the kind of the pacing, the slow to fast, all that stuff, if you can get that to look interesting before you apply a single material or lighting, you're off to a very, very good start. Most people don't consider that, and if you can, I think it's going to set you up to do much more interesting animations overall. So performance mode and geometry view. Okay, so I want to take a second to talk about some camera animation specific items. Alrighty, so path animation. When we go and look at the animation tools for KeyShot, there's this thing called an animation wizard. You click on it and it gives you a menu of a few ways you can animate a camera or a few ways you can animate a part. What I try to do is avoid falling victim to just like picking from a menu. Like I'd like to think of, oh, what would look cool, and then how would I go creating that, instead of just going, okay, let's see what my options are. I'll choose one of these, choose one of those. And in doing so, you can kind of create something that's more true to a unique vision that you might have to tell the story that you want to tell. Path animation is a great little tool that allows us to animate a camera throughout our scene, of course. And I've found more often than not that I can rely on the path animation to create, or just camera animations in general, more complex looking animations. For example, I'm going to show you an animation later where a product comes hurling through the air, and when it does that, you kind of want it to move on a couple different axes, and you know, if it's going, you know, this direction, then this direction, then that direction, and then it's panning this way. Like when you start adding all those or stacking all those animations, every once in a while KeyShot gets confused and it kind of gets stuck and it just doesn't execute those quite the way you'd like them to. And I found that it's easier to divide the job, split that labor up, and have your part do a couple simple animations and then rely on the camera to add the rest of that. And I'll show you what that means, or what that looks like in a little bit. I do want to also call out that our path animation for cameras, that does support camera targets, meaning you can choose an item that, you know, this will help keep it framed so it doesn't come, you know, disappear out of the frame while your camera is being animated around the part. Now, as far as editing camera animations, when you create them, something that I think anyone will agree here, if they've done it, working within the geometry view is a great way to control these animations because it's going to actually show you what happens and where they are. So things like the path, which is indicated here in red, this red line, and then the different cameras along that, those are the camera points along that path. You can go and use the move tool to kind of adjust where those are placed and how they're positioned. And then we also see things like the field of view and all those things. This just helps us better visualize what is happening in our scene. If you find that you're struggling to envision where things are going and why your object is disappearing, check out the geometry view and keep that open in a window. I find it's very helpful to work with both of those. So let's talk about depth of field really quickly. It's a great tool that helps us boost, or it can help us boost the realism of a shot, because for those who are not photography buffs here, that's when you're going to have a bit of your image is either out of focus, maybe the background or the foreground. So on either side of the focal point, you're going to have some blurred parts of your image. We can actually animate that. And in real life, something that I love in films is like when somebody's got a handheld camera and they pan, you've got character A over here and character B over there, and it pans, and then it's going to focus from one person's face to the next. What'll often happen is the guy focusing the camera, it takes, you know, even if they're really skilled, they may overshoot just by a hair and then come back a little bit just to focus. That's called focal drift. You can even do little stuff like that if you're like obsessed with details the way I am. You can build those in your animations, and that just goes to the next level of creating something really unique looking. I even, you know, even pulling from your favorite films, I did for a little, I was exploring a while back, and there's that scene in Jaws where, you know, they zoom in but they dolly the camera back and it does this crazy Hitchcock pull sort of effect where, you know, the main character is sitting there and then the background's distorting behind him. It creates this crazy effect. You can do that in KeyShot. Like, it's very, very simple to do, but like take inspiration from the films you enjoy and just see if you can reproduce like a teeny little bit of it. It's fun. So the geometry view I mentioned before, in KeyShot 7, we added the ability to visualize our depth of field planes, which is very nice. So these show us where things are in focus and out of focus. The center plane is where it's sharp and in focus, and then those outer planes are where it blurs. And as you go further from those, it gets more and more blurred. So an example of that being animated is here. So the camera focuses to the back of the chair and then back to the front. It's just, you know, something cool. There's other camera animations you can do, of course, but I just wanted to call attention to a few of the less used ones. Of course, there are the ones that are like, you know, your orbit and your dolly, like, you know, you've probably come across those before. Part animation. So a big thing I want to call out is the importance or the benefits of working with proper CAD models when it comes time to animate a model. So while you can use models from any 3D package, you know, whether it's 3ds Max, Maya, Blender, Modo, ZBrush, CATIA, Pro-E, SolidWorks, you know, I don't know, there's a million out there. Go on, you know, you can bring all those into KeyShot, and that's great, but there are inherent benefits to working with an actual CAD assembly. So this would be working with data from something like Fusion 360, SolidWorks, NX, Pro-E, you know, I'm sure I'm forgetting some big ones, but the idea here is that when you are working with data that has parent-child relationships and groups and assemblies and sub-assemblies, you can take advantage of that because it's going to keep a local axis for those parts and assemblies, which allows us to use our move tool to help our part move in a different direction. It can also make the process of creating exploded views very quick and easy. And things like linkages, if you have a hinge with like 2 or 3 hinge points, it can make that very easy to animate as well. And again, we do get into some of this in some of our other online webinars, so I'm not going to go super deep into this, but I do want to call out that there is a big benefit to this. In an example of what a local axis is here, so we've got this thing with all these little screws in it. Of course, we want them to explode in a kind of a radial fashion. If I create an animation and have them move along the y-axis, but these were modeled as a multi-body part, meaning I've got a single part with a bunch of pieces of geometry in it, they will behave like this. Sad, doesn't work. They just move the wrong way. Well, that's because they're all moving in KeyShot's y-axis. We expected and wanted them to move like this, which they're all moving in their own local y-axis. So that's like putting a little XYZ coordinate on each individual part. You can do that when you're working with CAD assemblies, which is really nice. Now pivots are a topic I want to touch on, but I'm not going super deep here because this is very specific to the program you're coming from, the data you're using, how it was modeled. And they vary in complexity depending on again, what you're trying to achieve and how the model is set up. But I do want to at least point out that usually when you animate a part, it's going to rotate around its center point. That means that the pivot in KeyShot defaults to the center of the object being moved or animated. However, you can always choose a pivot other than the center of the part. You can choose another piece of geometry, and then it will move in relation to that or relative to that other part. And so that's what we call pivots. And pivots themselves can be static, meaning they don't move, or they can be dynamic, meaning you can animate a pivot. What that means is, in this example, we got a little clock and it's going to spin around. A little bit loud. But those hands, we want them to pivot around the center of the clock, not the middle of each arm, right? So we had to make sure we picked a pivot that was, on the end of those arms, which could be the little pin there, or it could be the center of the clock face, as long as it's a symmetrical object where the center point of that object is going to be the right location of rotation. Now, in this example, we have a dynamic pivot, and when the chair rocks, it's still using the same very simple tools in KeyShot, but what's happening is there's a little cube that I've turned off so you can't see it, but it moves back and forth along the rails. And then that is the pivot point that the chair rocks on back and forth. So just using 2 little animations, I was able to build a very believable kind of something that looks like it was simulated with physics almost. It's pretty cool. So that's how you can take advantage of pivots, right? Another thing that's pretty cool is we've all seen the speed ramp effect. That's when something does not move in a linear path of motion. It can kind of, it can speed up, speed down. We see this a lot in action films, bullet time, there's a lot of names for it. Something like this though, it's kind of nice because the action draws us in, kind of like the Michael Bay film, but then the slow part allows us to focus on what is trying to be, it's like saying, hey, look at this detail. And then it speeds out to kind of like transition out of that. So something like that can be done by just breaking an animation into a few parts. Like instead of trying to do that in one swoop, I just had a 720 or a 1080 degree spin to spin it up in the beginning, and then it spun around like 30 degrees, just like really slow, and then continued that for another 3 rotations or whatever. And it's very simple, but that can do a lot to make animations look a lot more dynamic. And last but not least, I do want to talk about material animations. So we have an item in the KeyShot animation wizard that allows you to fade a part in or fade it out. And that's nice if you want something to appear or disappear from view. But it has its limitations and it can act up sometimes. And what I've found is that I use the material graph to do all of my material animations and fades. So in this case, A show of hands if you have never used the material graph. All right, so like 3 people. So most of you should at least have seen something like this in the past. So what you can do here is use a color fade or a number fade to control how something behaves. And this could be everything from, you know, making a bump map high or low or whatever. But the main case here I want to call out is using a color or number fade into the opacity of a material or like a layered material or the opacity of a material that is the parent material. And what that will do is it will make that part disappear essentially. Or in this example, it would basically take this layer of metallic paint that was on top of a layer of metal, and it will fade that metallic paint out and then back in. Now when we do a number fade, you fade from one value to another. It could be 0 to 1 or 1 to 0. And if it's going into opacity, opacity means it is how opaque it is. So if we go from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0, we're going from visible to invisible or visible or invisible to invisible. And if we're doing it on a setup like we have here, it's just going to fade out the top layer of material, okay? Also, in this example that we saw earlier, we have the flashing lights that kind of reminds us of like paparazzi almost, or some sort of glam shot, sort of, I don't feel like you've seen that in some commercial before. But that's done just by doing a color fade, where we just fade, in this case, instead of fading through a rainbow, I would just fade through white, black, white, black, white, black, and that's going into the opacity or the brightness of a physical light. So I had planes on either side of that orange marshmallow emitting light, and I'm fading them on and off, on and off, on and off. Very simple, but it gives a cool effect. So that's what I'm talking about, just thinking of different ways you can kind of add interest and excitement to your animations beyond using the standard palette of animations KeyShot's Animation Wizard offers up. A little bonus content here. So we did talk about studio switch events. So studios allow us to combine a lot of different factors or variables, and then they allow us to swap those on and off. You could swap out environments or multi-materials or whatever. In this case, I have 2 very different scenes. One was a studio environment with a green ground plane and a metallic green cube. The other one had no ground plane, or it was transparent. It was an outdoor environment, and it had a blue rectangular cube thing. And basically, we can switch between those. So if I were to play that here, as the camera pans, boop, we pop to the other one. Pretty cool. So this could be one way you could jump between scenes that you have like thumbnailed out in your storyboard if you need to. You know, and that's if you're kind of insistent and you really want to see this all in one KeyShot timeline. You don't have to do it that way. Alternatively, other things I've done is just create a studio for one sequence, could be like 100 frames, and then create studio 2, and that might be frame 200 to frame 500, and then studio 3 could be frame 305, and like you can label them as such, so when you go to render, you kind of keep track of what goes where. So there's lots of ways you can do this. I'm just trying to open up your minds to a couple different things you can try in KeyShot to, again, kind of have fun with your animations. So what might this look if we put these together? So given the short turnaround, I tried to take all these concepts and put them into something kind of interesting. And here's what I ended up with. So nothing too crazy there. It's pretty simple, but again, all done in KeyShot, you know. And there's slower parts there that you could, of course, later have somebody or even yourself go in and add little call-outs or little UI elements if you want to be like super nano-coated, whatever, hydrocarbon, something, I don't know, something fancy. But you can kind of call out the different parts, whatever. But yeah, so that had everything from camera animations to part animations to material fades and animations for light control and stuff. So last but not least, I do want to at least show you what this means, because we did add this to KeyShot 7, and this is the ability to take something that was animated in another package. This could be a baked out deformation. This could be something flexing, could be something shattering and breaking. It could be dynamics, bubbles, you know, all sorts of stuff. But if we were to build that in another program, could be Blender, Modo, Max, Maya, Cinema 4D, we can bake out that type of a simulation or that animation into something called an Alembic file. The extension is .abc. That's pretty easy to remember. And that's going to contain lots of information. So we can take that, bring that into KeyShot, and in the example on the side here, that's like just a cloth. It's just being dropped over like a cube, but then it imported into KeyShot, and we just applied some simple materials to it, and it's good to go. So that's another thing you can do to add to your scene as well, which is pretty nice. Boom. So that's the end of our presentation, right at the 30-minute mark. So we're halfway through. I'm going to switch over into KeyShot. I'm going to import our model, same one that I had here, and I'm going to start walking through kind of hands-on and see how far we can get. So let's go ahead and open KeyShot. And it took a second to import on the last workshop, so let's see. Hopefully it goes a little faster this time. I may have time for one question while it imports. We'll see. One thing I want to demo before I bring that one in here. I talked about the importance or the benefits of working with an assembly. Very many times people want to do an exploded view. I just want to show you a little shortcut I found. So if I import this, we have something that resembles a pile of blocks we might have played with as a kid. And if I want to explode these, what we can do is do that all with one animation, technically. And if we look at the scene tree, though, we'll notice there's this pattern of nesting. It may seem excessive, but essentially each one of these parts gets inserted into another level within the assembly. So I'm a Fusion 360 user, so in this case I started with the yellow block, extruded it. That was one component. Then I created a new component and I inserted it. I created a new component within that first component. And then I made the red circle. Then within that component, I created a new component, and then I extruded the green slot. And I kept following that process, and that gives us this nested effect in the tree. Well, here's where this benefits us in KeyShot. I could go to my animation wizard there, but all I need to do is click on the object here, right-click, and actually, if I do it at this very base level here, the yellow block will lift up. I actually don't want to animate the yellow part. So I'm going to go down one level to component number 2, which is this one here. If I right-click on it, go Animation, Translation, this is how I add my animations as opposed to going to the animation wizard. So now it's added to my timeline instead of clicking through all those menus. And then if I want to see what happens, all I do is I drag my time indicator to the right hand, the playhead to the right side. Let's throw this in a performance mode so we don't have shadows. So we see it starts moving up. So my Y translation is set to 1. I'll try 10. So there that goes. So again, what I like to do, instead of always going back and hitting play and seeing how it looks, my habit is I always create an animation and I always drag the playhead to the right to see where it's going to end up. And then as long as I'm happy with it where it ends up, I know that whatever motion it goes through to get there, I'm okay with. So now that that moved up, all I need to do is copy that translation here, right-click, copy animation. And if I select the 2 levels or components below that and I right-click, animation, paste, linked, what it's going to do is it's going to paste that animation onto both parts, but it links them. So we only have one item in our timeline, but they all move the same distance away from each other. So it's basically the blue ones are getting moved apart 10, 20, 30 millimeters off of the first starting position, 20 for the green, 10 for the red, and they kind of stack up like that. So if you have the ability to nest components that may be exploded, this can save you a ton of time. And then if you want, you can go in and adjust, you know, how far apart those go. Pretty nice. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful, and then I'm going to switch on over. We'll get back into KeyShot one more time, this time with the same assembly I used in my example. It's a nice little backpacking camper's stove, kind of a cool little piece of design. Any questions? Because I know this is going to take about a minute to import. Yeah.
Is there any plan to import motion studies?
I've actually been, you're not the first person to ask me that recently. I did not get a direct answer when I asked that to somebody. I guess so that's a no, but I have been told it should not be too complicated. If there's a developer in here, I'm probably dead, but I'll definitely introduce you to the person that you should ask that to because they can answer that better than I can. I'm not sure. Well, I'm sorry. You said motion studies. You're talking about SolidWorks.
Fusion 360.
Oh, okay. So here's the interesting thing. I thought you were talking like FEA analysis type stuff. Sorry. So SolidWorks, with the latest plugin, you actually can import a motion study made in SolidWorks. That is brand new, and that is currently supported by the newest plugin for SolidWorks 2018. Fusion 360, I don't know yet. Not as of now. So, sorry for misinterpreting you off the get-go, but yeah. So, if there is, like I said, if there is demand for that, certainly ask for it. That's the best way to get it implemented. I see another hand up. I'm going to hold off until we're a little bit further into our demo, or maybe toward the end. But jot down your question because I'd love to answer it. So, okay, so we have our stove here, our stove assembly. So here's the first thing I would do is, in my example, so I'm trying to think of common scenarios. Like, okay, so great, this is the file we were given, but our storyboard begins with our product folded up inside this little caddy or carrying case, kind of like hurling through the air. Okay, so how do we go from this to that and then make it animatable? That may sound like a bit of a chore. So first thing I'm going to do is, since I know that I may want to return to a state where it's already assembled like this, what I'm going to do is insert a copy of this into a new model set. And I don't need the gas can in that new model set. So what I'm talking about here is creating a new model set. And I can go ahead and say stove and caddy. And then if I expand the list of models here and I deselect gas can, it's going to insert this camping stove assembly without the gas can and this carrying case into a new model set. And that does effectively duplicate that geometry. Okay, so now I'm in the new model set, but if I ever want to, I can return to the state of where it's assembled and in context. But in this case, I know I'm going to put this inside this carrying case, and I'd rather not have to go realign them in the future. So I leave my backup. It's like kind of saving layer 0 in Photoshop, sort of. Okay, so now that I've done that, the first thing I want to do is fold this thing up so I can then place it inside this caddy. So the first thing we're going to do is get these arms to fold up. So if I click on one of these, it's selected in the scene tree. I'm going to go ahead and animate that right away by right-clicking and going to Animate and then Rotation. And of course, I want to bring my playhead to the end and see which way it starts going. So it's going the right axis, but it's both going the wrong direction, and it's rotating around its center. It's not pivoting around the point we want it to. So the first thing I'm going to do is find out if I can rely on the origin of that part in CAD, because that would be the least amount of effort at this point. So I can go ahead and try original local, turn sideways. I don't know about that. What about pivot point? What about the origin? So that's interesting. By clicking on that, it snaps to what seems to be the place I want it to pivot around, even though it's going the wrong direction. So if I go back up to my axis and I try a different axis, nope. Aha, so now this one is actually facing the right direction, even though it's going too far. This is actually indeed what we want, because it's going the right direction and it's pivoting around the point that we want it to. Now I see a few confused looks, and that's totally okay, because what I've done here is not something that too many people think of, but there are a number of ways KeyShot can identify the point at which the part rotates. So by default, it's always going to be the center of the part, the middle of it, but we can also choose to change the pivot point from the center of the part to the origin of that part in CAD. So when I modeled the arm of this little camping stove, the center of this hole happens to be the 0, 0, 0 point in that part. So if you are lucky enough to be the person modeling the model that you're going to work with, that you're going to animate, if something's going to ever articulate, go ahead and use that as the 0, 0, 0 point, and in KeyShot, get in the habit of always choosing rotate around the center pivot. And the reason, or the origin, the reason you might want to do that then is if we dial this in to, and you know, I happen to know I want that to be 28 degrees because I just did that, but so this guy is now folded up. The reason we might want to do this is I can now copy this animation with a right click, choose the other two remaining arms, paste it. Here we go. Animation, paste as a linked animation, and we notice they all snap exactly into the position we want them to. So why is this working and where's the benefit? So again, I've pasted this as a linked animation just like our nested exploded view, but so now they're all controlled and synced within this one animation that can be adjusted. But the main benefit here is that I'm not having to pick a pivot like a piece of geometry, because if I had this first arm rotating around this pin and then I paste that same animation as a linked animation on those other two arms, what would happen? They would all go the same direction around that one pivot, and it wouldn't be, I couldn't use that one over like I just did. So if we can, our first attempt should always be to try to animate around that object's origin. Now, if you're working with engineering data, very slim chance that's ever going to be the place you want it to rotate around, unless it's a symmetrical, like cylindrical object. So the next thing we can do, if that doesn't happen to be the case, is we can choose a pivot. So let's take a look at having to do that. Let's say, in this case, I want to take the bottom of this assembly, this base. So if I click on base assembly, it draws an orange outline. I want to rotate this so this brass pin is aligned with the yellow arm, okay? So I'm going to do another rotation, right click, animation, rotation, and drag the playhead to the end. Oh, okay, so it goes the wrong direction. Let's fix that. So I want to go Y. So, but here's what's happening now. It's rotating around the center point of this entire assembly, which now throws it off axis. So what we can do is we can pick a pivot, and I want it to rotate around the center column here. So if I say pivot point, we don't want this to be the self. We want it to actually be a different part. So I'm going to choose pick. And I could choose from this list, but it's far easier just to click in the real-time view. Now we have a dashed line with a dot in the center. It will rotate around the dot. So if I hit OK, now what we notice is if I do this, it's actually rotating around the center point perfectly the way we want it to. So that's an example of choosing the pivot point instead of relying on the origin, the original origin. Now if I want to rotate this little nozzle or the thing that controls the gas flow, I'm going to go ahead and click on the part to find out where it is in the assembly. So it's this adjuster gasket piece. Right click, animation, rotation. If I try this out, it seems to work pretty well, but if this little wire piece was asymmetrical, I'd be out of luck. So again, how would I fix that? I would go ahead and choose pick, and I would make sure that the object it's rotating around is symmetrical and it's in the dead center of that part. So in this case, I could rotate it, and when I did that, yes, it moved, but I can just tell it to rotate around the appropriate axis, and now it stays in place. It's good. So there are multiple ways you can actually animate something if it's symmetrical in some cases. Now I want to rotate this wire piece in to fold it up. And this one's interesting because it's not symmetrical and there's nothing I can choose to pivot around. Well, naturally. So if I select it and I right click, do another animation as a rotation, drag this guy on out, we're going to see that it rotates around itself. And inside the hole here, of course, because I blocked this in and I learned very quickly that I needed something for it to rotate around, I put an extra cylinder in there. So I kind of cheated, but I mean, there's nothing wrong in going back and forth. When I do animations, I block in a model super crude, like just blocks and cylinders and like super, super crude. And I bring it into KeyShot to make sure it animates. And then I learn like, oh, no, this needs to be part of this assembly. So I go back to my modeling program and I readjust things. Then I go back. I do that back and forth before I worry about any details on the model. And I highly recommend you do that because you do that first and it'll ensure that you'll be able to animate it very, very well down the road. Otherwise, it can be a pain to try to do it the other way. So in this case, I'm going to pick that cylinder to animate around. There we go. And it already is going the right direction, it looks like. I just need to go further. About 140 degrees about. There we go. So now if I did not have that cylinder in there, what would I do? I would go to Edit. If you've never done this before, this is pretty cool. Add Geometry, add a cylinder. It's in here somewhere. There we go. And it puts a cylinder in my scene. And I could scale that down, even though the size is technically irrelevant. I could scale that down. And then I could choose a pivot and choose that actual piece. Okay. And then I could snap it to that pivot. So now it's lined up with the middle of this brass piece. And then I could just drag it on out until it lined up with the center of that pin. And it would serve the same purpose. And I could do one of two things. I could make it so small that it is invisible because it's hidden by the other part. Or I could make sure in my scene tree that I just turn the eyeball off and then that part's hidden. So there's totally ways you can, there's again, multiple ways you can do this. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at our folded up object. The next thing we need to do is place this inside our caddy because we want to animate the two as a group. So I would go ahead and make sure I turn off the top of that. There we go. And now I want to move this inside there. What's the fastest way to do that? Here's a little pro tip for you. Hold Shift, left click drag to draw a box around your object. There we go. And now Control D will open my move tool and I can choose a pivot, and my pivot is going to actually be my caddy, the center of this. And now if I hit snap to pivot, they're now overlapping. They're in the same space. KeyShot for some reason opens it back up. It kind of forgets that animation. That's just while the move tool is activated. It'll close back up in a second. So if I hit this button, closes back up. Now we're good, although I do see a couple things. One, I see that this is protruding through. So I'm going to turn off the bottom piece of the little stove caddy, and I'm going to rotate the base of this around. Looks like when I did that correctly, but it goes too far. I want it to align with the yellow arm. So I can click on this animation and fix it. So instead of going a full 90 degrees, I'll try 30. There we go, and it lines up just perfectly. So now if I turn this stove back on, or the little caddy back on, we can see it's pretty good. It's still a little off center, and that's because this object is asymmetrical, the stove. So if I grab the entire assembly again, the camping stove assembly, and I move it on over with that move tool, from the top view we can just pop it on over a little bit, and now it should be contained within the object. Cool. So now that I've done that, if I turn the top on, if I want to animate this coming apart, all I need to do is continue how I have been doing. So I can grab the top, right click, animate, translation, and drag us to the right. It goes up. Let's type in 150. And then now I can go ahead and grab the camping stove and do the same exact thing. Although I don't want it to go a full 150. I'll go to, let's see, we'll drag this guy out, and then let's go to 100. And then it clears the actual caddy. Maybe I'll do 120. Okay. Now, of course, in my example, what I did before was I didn't want to see a ground plane. So I went over to my environment. I went ahead to my ground, and I turned off the ground shadows. And instead of a white background or a gray background, I chose a solid black background. So now we're in outer space. Then, of course, and here's the thing, is the benefit of doing all this kind of animation is we can then, or moving these parts in animations, we can always undo that. So we can have the opposite, the mirrored effect. So let me show you what I mean. If I grab the parts that we used to fold up the stove, which is going to be these first 4 transforms. If I had time, I would have named all those properly. But I'm going to right click and add those to a folder and call this stove fold. Now what we can do is we can go ahead and let's just take all of these animations and just do this. Let's make this guy a little bit faster. And then scoot these guys down. So what I can do is I can take my stove that folds up and I can do a mirror, and this is going to do the opposite. So I can place this once it's actually opened. So if I play this all back, of course this doesn't make sense quite yet, but if we play it all out, there we go. So it kind of does all that. Okay, so a couple things are going weird. Let's go ahead and make sure that this does not loop. So I can turn off this looping button. And if I want to make sure that the animation starts with everything already inside the stove caddy, so I can select all three of these, make sure there's some breathing room, and I can start this at the 2-second mark, and I can grab this little flag at the bottom of my timeline, and this hashed area, this kind of crosshatch area, this gets ignored. So this changes the beginning of the animation to happen at 2 seconds, and it ignores that first part. So what I can do is when I play, it's going to just show me this part, which does exactly what I want it to. And then, you know, so there's a lot of times when I will have something explode or assemble or something, and then hide that in the beginning, just so I have it later to reverse in the end. Other things we can do is we can play with things like our time settings. We can change from linear to ease in, ease out to kind of, you know, have variable speed as it moves throughout the animation. Another thing that we can do is if I have, let's go back to our scene here. So things are getting pretty busy here. If you ever need to collapse all these, I don't know if you've done this before, but you can right click to the side and say collapse all, and then open it back up, and that has everything collapsed. Okay, so we have our camping stove and our camping stove caddy. In my case, if I wanted to animate those as a group, I kind of need them to be in the same group. So I might actually take my camping stove caddy and then insert it into the camping stove. Or I could do the other one, but do know that if you later in the game, meaning as you've already added your animations, if you start regrouping things, you may inadvertently have things moving where they should not be moving. That's something to think about ahead of time. So, meaning I have the top of the stove caddy moving up and open, and then the camping stove moves up. But now if I were to insert the caddy into the camping stove, when the camping stove moves up, then the caddy itself is going to move up with it. So just again, consider the order of operations when grouping things like that. So that's really the process I go through. It's you know, all those little details come down to your level of patience, what you're hoping to achieve, how much time you have, everything like that. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and close this real quick. I'm not going to save it. I'm going to go into one of the actual scene that I created that animation with, so you can see what went into it. So if I go ahead and look at this guy, yep, you'll be able to see what the timeline looks like and a couple other things. I want to show you the geometry view where I animated the camera versus the parts. So that was another key feature there. So I'm going to go ahead and put a temp folder on my desktop here. Okay. All right, so here we have the animation. So you can see I did the trick where I started the animation. The same exact thing where you can actually see, if I were to zoom in there, you will see, let's see. So I'm going to turn off motion blur. I guess for little aside here, since we're talking about advanced animations, if you want your stuff to look as realistic as possible, use motion blur. I did not talk about that, but motion blur is essentially when it's going to create this ghosting trail effect. So if you've ever seen a photograph of a car where the wheels are kind of blurred because they're spinning really fast, faster than the shutter of the camera, they're going to create that ghosted effect. They get blurred. That's called motion blur. It can occur when a part moves quickly, faster than the shutter speed of a camera, or it can happen when a part is stationary and a camera moves fast, okay? And so if you enable both of these, they will absolutely slow down the rendering process. but they will absolutely give you a more realistic, it just looks a lot smoother and nicer. So I'm going to turn them off for the sake of performance, but that's, you enable them by just clicking this little blue line, like with this guy here. Okay, so if I go ahead and look at this, the other thing I want to do is make sure I'm in a free camera. So right now I'm in Studio One. I want to go to a free camera so I can look at my scene nice and close here. So when I do this, you can see that in the beginning, my stove is folding up and getting placed inside the stove caddy. Right? So it's actually, this animation actually doesn't start until the whole thing starts moving, which is right here. So at 4 seconds. So I actually would pull this guy out here, 4 seconds. And then when I play it back, I will go to Studio One. So I'll hit U. It's my studios. So if I go to Studio One, it ensures that I've got the correct camera, the correct environment, and then the correct model set. Because as mentioned before, we have 2 model sets. I have the default one where I used where the stove came down on the gas can in the end and everything. So if I go ahead and look at how this runs, if I look at my geometry view, which is under Edit Geometry View, or I'm sorry, View Geometry View, or otherwise you can hit O. What this does is this shows me all the things I've animated in my scene and what it looks like. So this is pretty interesting. I've got the camera we're looking through, this big long lens here, and then I've got my stove. And notice, this is what's interesting, the stove itself, as I play it back, let's play our animation back, you can see it doesn't move. See how the stove just sits in one place the whole time? You thought it was coming toward us. It's my camera that's going toward it. So what I did is I tried to reduce the number of movements if I could. I kept the stove centered in the middle of KeyShot file the whole time, and I had the camera move around it while it did little simple things like open up and just spin around its central axis. That way, it was so much easier to then reassemble it shut. If they're moving along X, Y, and Z axes and spinning and stuff, it would take you way too long using trial and error to, half a degree there to like reassemble this assembly. So I basically decided early on that I would keep the camera the model centrally located, and it would only open up this way and it would only spin around its own axis, and I would let the camera move around it. And that was the way of sharing or splitting up those complex movements. So if I continue playing that, and then I guess the other thing I didn't mention here, I have a camera switch event right here, this little blue dot. So when our model's coming toward us, once my camera got inside the model, it switches to another camera. So it's in, it moves essentially, it stays in Studio One, but then it switches to, if we were to see Studio Two, it switches to the second camera. So that allowed me to essentially cut really quickly from one camera that was moving in to one that was pulled back doing a different thing. So rather than making a camera do like 100 animations, if you can, I find it easier to do like 2 or 3 simple animations per camera and just cut from camera to camera to camera. And then lighting wise, as we saw in our geometry view, I've got a couple of planes. One's cool, one's warm, hence the bluish, hence the reddish, and then this little spotlight up here to pop out all these little sharp details. So the small one up overhead is very, very bright, and these other big fills are very, very, they're not very bright and they're very soft. They're just filling out the warm and cool tones. And I made those invisible to the camera. So they're in our scenes, but we don't actually see them. And then the last little trick I wanted to show you is at the very end when the light wraps around. That's pretty cool. I was getting asked about that earlier. This guy. So when I play this back, let's reset this. So when I do this, so it spins around, and then see how the light comes around the front of this? It kind of reveals it. So what I did with that was pretty neat. That was just a happy accident. And the way that happened was here, I've got the original model set that I started with, so I didn't have to reassemble this after tearing it apart. I had that saved. And then what I did was I have a simple camera. All it's doing is, you can see the red line. The camera is basically moving in Well, actually, it starts at the bottom. It starts at the bottom, and it comes up through the ground plane, and then it moves back. And then what happens is this plane is pretty much my only light in the scene. I use the HDRI turned down super low as a fill light, but then this plane comes around, and see how it comes around? It then illuminates the front of the can. And it's simple because all I've done when I go to move this plane, you can see I can take a pivot and I can pivot around the can, and now this is essentially what it's doing. So I was doing this to see where I wanted my light to be placed on the object, and I'm like, wait, I can just animate it because that's like that's a piece of geometry. So you can do that, and it makes for way more interesting, realistic type of animation. So anyway, we are at 1 hour. I really appreciate your guys' attention, your patience, and yeah, please ask questions a little bit later, or catch me in the hallway, or when we're mingling. Thanks, and enjoy your break.